Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by Sharon Bush, the executive director of the Grand Victoria Foundation. Sharon is one of the really impressive, dynamic leaders in philanthropy in Illinois and really across the country. Sharon is from Chicago. She studied at the U of I and also Roosevelt University. Came back to Chicago, has been in philanthropy for many years, has risen up the ranks and has kind of seen how it works from the ground level. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of pick her mind on that. She's been at Grand Victoria for about 8 years and has risen up the ranks. I think her first job was as director of programs for Elgin, which is one of the places where it's based, and then also became the managing director, and then recently, or a year or two ago, the executive director. One thing I want to say about Sharon, she was a really important and consequential leader in the Illinois COVID Relief Fund, an initiative that raised and dispersed $30 million or so. And I've talked to some people who worked with her and said that she was just kind of a model of both strategic savvy and technical expertise and tactical savvy, and was both tough-minded and kind-hearted, and was just a real model of a leader. So we're really delighted that Sharon is with us today. Sharon, good morning.
Good morning. What a delightful introduction.
Well, my pleasure. It's great to meet you, as we've had a nice conversation beforehand. But Sharon, let's start with your background. I know you grew up in Chicago. I've heard you say on the West Side. Tell us about your journey from Chicago to Champaign, where we went to U of I, and then your return back to Chicago.
Yeah, I think I'll start with a piece of me that is really a strong piece of my identity, which is I did grow up on the West Side of Chicago. So I grew up in Garfield Park. And if anyone knows, it's the place where the Garfield Park Conservatory is a hub of that neighborhood. So I grew up on both the west and the east sides of the park. I say that a lot because like in my academic journeys and in my professional journeys, I actually rarely meet other African-American professionals from the West Side. You mostly meet others from the South Side of Chicago. So I take a lot of pride in that. I went to public schools all my life. So I was in CPS schools. I went to Lane Tech High School. And that's probably the place where I learned a lot about figuring out how to be among a lot of different people. From Lane Tech, I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign. I was the first in my family to go to college and complete college, actually. And I went to U of I on scholarship. So I was very grateful for that. And because I went to school on scholarship, I just really feel like there's such a responsibility to give back, because I was given so much and was able to get through school on time, in 4 years, and to do well in college. Champaign was a wonderful place. So I know the platform here is Southern Illinois University, but going to school at the University of Illinois was fabulous. It was really probably the place where I came of age. It was probably a place where I realized more of kind of my activism sides, even though I was a business major when I was there. I am fortunate enough to, even now, like in my professional career, like if you are in Chicago, probably anywhere in the state, but definitely in the Chicago region, you get the benefit of seeing a lot of alums like in different walks of life. So it's a huge, wonderful network of people that I probably still leverage pretty highly today. So that was a wonderful experience of going there. Actually went back home after U of I to a recession. So I graduated in the early 90s. It was a recession when I went back. So I actually had a tough time getting into the economy at the time. So had a lot of different jobs to begin with. And I actually started my family early. So I had a seminal job where I actually worked for a publishing company, an African-American publishing company on the South Side. I did marketing work there, but I had kind of a side gig there too, where like I worked 6 days a week. And on the 6th day, I used to manage a program that was for tutoring and a summer academic program. So these families would come and bring their children, and were just really, really dedicated to the education and success of their kids. And I loved it. I loved it more than my 9 to 5, Monday through Friday job. And that was the thing that inspired me actually to go back to graduate school to get a master's degree in public administration. I kind of figured that I wanted to do more of the public service side of work. And that's what led me to go back to Roosevelt. And I chose that place because it is an institution of social justice. And so that resonated with me at the time.
No, was your venture to U of I, was that your first really foray in downstate Illinois? Had you spent most of your time in Chicago? And do you remember your first impressions as you were heading down, maybe on the train to Champaign?
So my parents drove me down there to go. It was my first time away from home. I had never been away from home before. We went in a little bitty Hyundai at the time, me, my mom, my dad. And they took me there and they dropped me off. They did not walk around the campus. We didn't do any of that, right? And what I remember, because it's summer, right? You get there in late August, was that this place is ginormous. This place is ginormous. And I had come from a large high school where there were like 4,000 or 5,000 kids who went to the school. But the University of Illinois, just landing there was actually, for me, it was actually really overwhelming. If I had to do it all over again, I might go to a smaller school, I have to say. But that's how overwhelming it felt in the beginning of trying to figure out how to navigate different systems just to be independent, learn how to be independent. But I had to do that super quickly.
And was business? Yeah, I know you were like in business management, or was that a kind of clear calling, or did you kind of go in a couple different directions and end up there?
No, that's a really great question. When I was in high school, I was in a program where I forgot the name of it, but it was like we were like business entrepreneurs, and I loved the program, and so I thought I wanted to be a business major. So I applied into the business school. I got in, and I didn't realize that it was really hard to do that at the time, right? But I was lucky enough to get into the school like from the outset. And then I kind of hated it, I will admit. It wasn't like my thing. And I discovered that actually, it was the first time that I actually failed a class ever. I failed an accounting class. I sucked at that, actually. And I had to take it over, and I got put on academic probation. It was like devastating because that just wasn't, I was always a great student. But I think I was just having a tough time, like just figuring out how to get the right kinds of supports, because I was never that kid who would actually leverage those kinds of programs or anything. So I didn't really know how to do it. I ended up changing my major from accounting to business administration, and I concentrated in marketing, which I loved better. And one of the things that I found that I liked, I took these classes that were around organizational psychology and organizational behavior. I really liked those classes as part of that concentration in my business degree. So I decided I wasn't going to switch to something else. But that was like the beginning of something, because those things I still use in my work today. So there are things actually about being a business major that I use a lot still today. And particularly when I think about ways to communicate, what to communicate, how to do that, I think I still draw on those experiences from undergrad in my work at the foundation, actually.
Now, your first, as I understand it, foundation job was the Lloyd Fry Foundation. Tell us about that. And I think you were there for 9 years. So you really kind of put in your dues there. Tell us about that experience.
I did. I came to the Lloyd A. Fry Foundation. Actually, I used to work at a policy advocacy organization. So I used to do policy advocacy work. And I did that around workforce development and employment. So when I came to the Lloyd A. Fry Foundation, the foundation was it just had a new president. I was her very first hire. I think I was the first person of color to be hired as a program officer there. So the person who manages grants and whatnot. And I came to start a new program there. So they had just reorganized the grant making and started an employment program. So it was all the stuff that I had been doing before in terms of understanding public systems and those sorts of things, and training programs and those sorts of things. So I started a program there from the very beginning. The Lloyd A. Fry Foundation, its grant making is all contained within the city of Chicago. So all of my work was with organizations that were based in Chicago and that served Chicago residents. I always, my experience at the Fry Foundation was pretty profound because I had not experienced the city in the way that I did as a program officer. You have this really interesting perch where you have such a bird's eye view to things in the city in a way that you don't, like as a resident or just working and living in the city. And the thing that I saw that I think still sticks with me today is this huge inequity. And in some ways we probably were perpetuating that unintentionally. But I remember lots of places where I would go to visit grantee organizations were never from the places that I was from. So I knew that I grew up with not a lot. Other people who lived around me didn't have a lot, but those were not the places that I was going. So I knew the places in the city where, poor people lived or where there were problems, but the organizations often weren't in the same neighborhoods. So that was jarring to me. And then when I was going to different neighborhoods where there were other people that either looked like me or where you knew that there were, real systemic issues, it was a harder time to get them funded. So that was also jarring. That wasn't what I thought the experience was supposed to be, right? But we talk about a lot of ways, metrics and things where we want to fund people that already have very strong established track records of success, rather than helping people, come along on an evolution. So those are the, ways that the philanthropy system was set up. And sometimes it just didn't match with where the greatest need was, even though there was always the good intentions to, fund in a way that did the most good, right? So those experiences that I had and a lot of the conversations that I had over the years with people who were funded, who were not funded, who I tried to help have access to either Fry Foundation funds or other foundations, you try to connect people. They stick with me quite a bit in terms of, I think I'm always struck by how hard people work to make something good happen. I've had many experiences like that over my career where frontline workers work really hard. They want to do good things for people who should benefit from the services, programs that exist. But the rules in terms of the way they have to operate are constraining or, create barriers to access to services in the way that they should be. So I think that that's been a theme that I've seen throughout. I think that's something I learned really strongly during my time at the Fry Foundation. It really was, that experience was a bridge to starting my time at Grand Victoria Foundation, where the approaches are different. So at the Fry Foundation, we funded a lot of direct services organizations. So those are things that actually relieve the symptoms of issues, right? Symptoms of poverty, symptoms of racism, those sorts of things, right? Very necessary thing to do. So that's just one piece of it. But we weren't getting to more of the deeper things always, right? So sometimes we would do that work, but mostly direct services. And at Grand Victoria Foundation, the approach was more around policy advocacy systems change. And I think that that was an approach taken because of the mission of the foundation, which is statewide. The resources, you don't want to say finite, that doesn't really quite sound right in philanthropy, but somewhat limited resources in terms of how do you service the state this big, right, with the diverse needs that it has. So it makes sense to take a more systemic approach versus figuring out how to fund a lot of service organizations that really are often funded by the public sector and then enhanced by philanthropy often when you think about it from a direct services perspective.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the history of Grand Victoria. I believe it was started in 1996. It receives like a significant part of your funds from the casino in Elgin that I think dedicates like 12.5% of its net operating income to your foundation. Tell us about the history of it and how its mission compelled you to join the effort.
John, I think you know everything. I'm not sure what else to say, but I will just say Grand Victoria Foundation is a really unique funder within the state of Illinois. There's just a handful of funders that have a statewide mission, so we have that. There's a handful of funders that I could probably count on one hand that are multi-issue and statewide. So we're very unique in that sense. We were founded in 1996 and we started our operations in 1997. We started them in Elgin. Grand Victoria Casino, the foundation came online as a result of a deal to get a license to create Grand Victoria Casino. So it's probably a more colorful story than we might tell the audience in terms of how the deal got done. But it's a very proud moment to create the foundation as part of that. The Grand Victoria Casino gives away 20% of its net operating income for charitable purposes. And so 12.5% of that on an annual basis comes to Grand Victoria Foundation. And then the other goes to Kane County, actually. So we get that annual contribution. We get that contribution annually every year in terms of like what the casino makes. We started our grant making in Elgin, actually. So our first office was in Elgin, Illinois, and we still have a physical office there still. And it's literally down the street from the casino. We can walk to it. What we did at the time was we really worked with a lot of like the civic leaders and residents there to figure out like what was the best way to do grant making. We ultimately created a program in Elgin that was very responsive to the needs of Elgin residents and the organizations there that served them. So we did a lot of things that are now talked about in philanthropy as like radical ideas. We did a lot of general operating support, multi-year support, a lot of work to ensure that there was strong organizational infrastructure for organizations in Elgin. And so we did that for over a decade there. So that work helped us set really strong relationships in the community, strong roots in the community. In order for us to operate more statewide, that wasn't kind of the full base or platform. So we opened an office in downtown Chicago where many more of like the advocacy groups were based. So it helped us establish relationships more broadly to fulfill our mission more broadly. So that's how that happened. But our work really started with having people give us input into how we should design what the work looks like. And I think now like we've come full circle to what it looks like. I was drawn to Grand Victoria Foundation, I think mostly because of what I just said before. I always have seen that structures and systems are the things that end up not being super responsive to the ways in which people want to work and like what it is that they really need. So in order to have more lasting change, it's just an approach that I am personally drawn to. And the work at Grand Victoria Foundation has been that. And the other thing over the years at Grand Victoria Foundation is really just doing a lot of different and innovative things. we built and developed really strong, fabulous relationships with community foundations across the state. And now what we have is a really healthy system of community foundations that operate through something called the Alliance of Illinois Community Foundations, which we helped to support and seed. So we now have partners all around the state. We help to capitalize them better, help them build the right kind of ability and skills to do fundraising differently, to manage their endowments. So we have wonderful partners around the state to do our work. That kind of like more work around like getting to the root of systems is just, I just believe in the approach. So that's what drew me to Grant Victoria Foundation, and it is what keeps me here still.
Well, tell us about rising through the ranks. I mean, I know you started out in Elgin, the Elgin programs, but then after a number of years, you became the managing director, and then relatively recently, the executive director. First of all, what's the difference between executive director and managing director in terms of responsibilities? And also, I think you succeeded, the only other CEO of the foundation. So you are coming on board, and there's someone who's already had a decade and a half or so legacy. So you're operating in a system that he or she had created. So talk about that.
Where should I start? I started at the Pride Foundation as a program officer. So that's like kind of an entry-level job into philanthropy. And so I've been a program officer, I've been a senior program officer, I've been a program director, I've been a managing director, and now chief executive as an executive director. So I really have literally had almost every kind of job that you could have. Mostly the differences between those jobs is like, sometimes it's a little bit more responsibility, it's seniority, right? So it does help you move differently in terms of the different groups you could be part of to influence kind of more external like practices that actually can enhance the work of the institutions that you are at. So like that's like kind of what it means to be a senior program officer or a program director. The difference between being a managing director and an executive director is probably razor thin in some ways. As an executive director, you're responsible for everything, right? And everything includes things like, having to have like fundamental understanding of like the investments in the endowment, which is different, right? You have the final responsibility for all of the talent like in the organization, and it's a way that's different from a managing director. You get to set policy, align that stuff with mission in a way that's different than I had the opportunity to do as a managing director. So that ultimate kind of responsibility, there is just a degree of elevation in terms of the amount of things that I touch, but the amount of things that I can help influence in terms of the direction of the foundation than I did a few years ago when I was the managing director. So I think all of the things that I've experienced in philanthropy over, and when I say philanthropy, I'm using it in this context, it's just the foundation part, not time that I spent working in nonprofits before that. But it's now been about 16 years or so, 17 maybe, something like that. I carry all of those experiences into the job that I have now. And I also wrap into my experience as the chief executive at Grant Victoria, just my lived experience too. So, so much of what I've seen in terms of inequity, like whether it's in the city of Chicago, I think at Grant Victoria, learning about that differently in terms of how disconnected the rest of the state is from the Chicago metropolitan region, how aware everyone is of that. What does that mean when we talk about or define equity? What does that mean when we talk about or define equity even further to think about racial equity? How do I think about those things as an African-American woman who grew up in a place that, that in a very modest way, with parents who didn't graduate college, right? So we are moving to a place at the foundation, at Grand Victoria Foundation, that's not dissimilar from how we're seeing the world move, right? And that we can't continue to either just kind of have a blind eye toward these kinds of social and economic and racial inequities and injustices, because the more that we do that, the more entrenched we probably will be in the way that we are working now as a country, not even just as a state, right? Which is very divided, very siloed, right? People talk to people that they already agree with and know. And those things create a lot of gridlock for systems to actually change and move differently and be more responsive to those who need it the most, whether they're in rural areas or whether they're in rural and poor areas, or whether they're in rural, poor, and segregated areas, right? Like, so those are all these different layers of things that are challenges that this state has. And I feel very, this past year makes me feel really motivated to, and really privileged to be able to lead the foundation in a way that can help us figure out how might we respond to like what we see in the world today. So, you know, that takes us really to kind of the present, is like where we've been, right? Which is, I know there's lots of talk about the pandemic, right? COVID-19, and who knew we would be talking about it still almost a year later, and that it's even as intense as it is, much more than it was in the summer. But it also like really strips away, like just that has just illuminated all of the other things that we had before, right? So it makes it more urgent to try to take these more long-term, more structural approaches to addressing problems. I feel like that's more urgent now than ever.
Well, let's talk for a second about the Illinois COVID Relief Fund, because you, as I mentioned earlier, were a really integral part of that effort. And it was, from what I've been able to piece together, a kind of remarkable effort. You were working, you know, separately in terms of physical location, but came together and raised and distributed more than $30 million across the state. What did you learn about Illinois in just the effort on the COVID-19 fund?
I think I'd like the very simplest thing that I learned in general and about the state is like where there's a will, there's a way. So when there's a really big problem and everybody agrees that it's a really big problem and everybody agrees that we all need to like figure out how to address it right now, we can do that. So what the Illinois COVID Response Fund did is it mobilized that $31 million super fast, right? Within a matter of weeks, that money was organized from individuals, from corporations, from philanthropy, from wealthy families, right? And so all of that money was, those resources were organized and ready to deploy. All of the work that at least Grand Victoria Foundation had been doing and others, right, to really elevate the work of community foundations in the communities which they represent, all of that was able to be leveraged through the ICRF, where they were ready. They knew their communities. Money could be redistributed to them and they could redistribute it out really quickly because it was really urgent at the time. We didn't know what we were dealing with, and we knew that people were losing their jobs like this. And so all of these issues that we've been working on already, right? If people were working on food or hunger issues or healthcare issues, they were all like acute. So we were able to like leverage those partners really quickly and further solidify those relationships. I think at the end of the day, the things that I guess people see as differences between regions, or whether they're differences between Chicago and downstate, which is the rest of the state, right? I don't know. In some ways, I know that there are real differences there, but also at the end of the day, COVID reminded us that the differences are not that stark, right? Everybody needed food. Everybody needed internet to do remote whatever, right? Some places needed that more than others. Some places were less invested in historically than others. But at the end of the day, like, we all needed those things. And so it was really fascinating and really gratifying to work with people, to give money out to each county, 101 counties in Illinois. We did that. We tried to take an approach to learn about the places where people were most impacted, whether that was economically, whether that was socially. And we, like, with each round of funding, we learned differently how people were being affected, and were able to respond to that. So my biggest lesson is that, like, we can do things when we really are called to do that. And, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same, like, right? COVID was a big change, but it really laid bare all the things that we already knew were not great. So all of those things were still the same, and they're still going to be the same, like, after the pandemic, the virus leaves us, right? So we can't keep doing things the same, because the more things change, and if they still stay the same, that isn't going to be good for kind of the future of the state, particularly if what we're wanting to have is a much more unified state that is economically resilient, environmentally resilient, like all these things. So we actually need to depend on each other, which is probably the last lesson that not just COVID, but probably the murder of George Floyd reminds us, is that there's so much interdependency. People don't really realize it in their everyday lives, right? But I have a neighbor who probably did a Facebook post or something that basically said that he didn't feel safe, right? And so he wanted to have a particular person, like, in office as president, so that he could make sure that he felt safe. We live in Bolingbrook, Illinois. It's a very safe community. Nobody's, you know, coming to, you know, there's not a lot of protesting, not a lot of, you know, uprising. People are pretty well off for the most part. So what does it mean for somebody to feel unsafe in a pretty typically safe community? But that's a real statement and a real sentiment that he had. But what that says to me is, a person can be in a safe community and not feel safe because other people are not safe, right? And those other people who don't feel safe, who don't feel protected, who don't feel seen or respected, if they're hitting the streets and that makes other people feel unsafe, that is an interdependence that is important and needs to be paid attention to, right? You can't keep leaving groups of people behind, because it does affect everyone. So it'll affect how he might move, or, you know, where he might live or whatever, right? But these things are all related. So COVID, and probably like the racial, kind of the new, you know, racial justice movement that we're in, just reminds me of what is it? We are my brothers and sisters keepers. That's really true.
Well, Sharon, I think it was in June, you wrote a very much discussed and really profound essay in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And the title was called "Racial Equity Needs to Be More Than Philanthropy's Catchword." And I want to read a couple passages and then maybe just have you kind of fill out the context, because this was after, of course, COVID is raging, the murder of George Floyd. That provides a context in which you write, I'm tired of feeling anger, frustration, constant disappointment. I'm angry that violence is used so often and with such impunity against African Americans in this country. I'm frustrated that too many white people still do not realize that they must be part of the solution to structural racism. The oppressed cannot fight this alone. And I'm disappointed that so many people in philanthropy still quietly voice support for racial equity and justice, but do not publicly advocate for fair and just treatment for African Americans and other people of color. Tell us about that article, what spurred it, what reaction you've gotten, and how you think that may have shaped the debate that's going on right now.
I have to say so the very personal piece. It came from, so I say that first to say, what I'm going to describe is my experience. But it came from being really exhausted by the pace of work on the Illinois COVID response fund, quite frankly. Like, we were working really, really hard because we were really, really committed to making sure that we could deploy those funds as best we could and as quickly as we could. But I have to say, in all of my years of philanthropy, I had never worked like that before. So just the pace of it was really, really fast, and sometimes it was exhausting to do that. Always gratifying, but sometimes it was tiring. When George Floyd was murdered, it was just it's just shocking. So even for somebody like me, where there are certain things that you talk about in your homes that you're not totally shocked by all the time because you have seen or lived them in some form. But this felt different. So I imagine this felt different for a lot of people based on the response that we saw in the summer. But it did affect the mood of the people who were working on the COVID response fund at the time. And we were continuing to work at this really, urgent pace. But that murder said, stop. It was just a call to say we have to pause. And we weren't really doing that. So that was very frustrating to me. And what it said to me was that it's much easier for people to not engage that, right? It's much easier to not engage something that is just horrifying, right? To see someone who's killed in broad daylight in such a calm and callous way. And it was, I was asked to say, well, do you want to, say something to your colleagues about where we are in the moment? And it was the very last thing that I wanted to do, right, is to represent something that was even traumatic to me. And that wasn't taken into consideration, that kind of trauma might be different than anybody else who was on the committee, because there were just a handful of other Black colleagues who were doing that work. So I was frustrated. I was upset. I was disappointed. And I didn't have a voice. I didn't feel like I had an outlet to say that. So, and it wasn't just a moment that I was in. It really was representative of a lot of things that I had already experienced in philanthropy. So everything that I just said to you before is like not going to the neighborhoods where you know that the need is most, creating barriers for those communities in ways that others don't have. Having perceptions about leaders in ways that, others don't have to carry the burden. it was the culmination of all of these experiences wrapped up in the moment this past summer. And I just felt super frustrated, right? The pace at which we work sometimes feels so slow, and then something hits us right between the eyes that says, yeah, do it differently. So the reactions, I didn't know, I didn't write it to get a bunch of reactions to it. I have to say I wrote it really to just express, to have a place to express a lot of things that I had seen over time and that I was feeling in a moment. The response that I got, I would say for my own, within my own organization is maybe where I can start, or what's best, or what's most important to me is, this is great, so what are we gonna do? So what happened is it created a whole wonderful opportunity for Grand Victoria Foundation to lean into giving a voice to racial equity and justice more, to figuring out, to being committed to figuring out how to structure that within our organization more, for us to take that commitment very seriously, so the board can keep me accountable to saying, how might we do this, right? And I use that as an example of a response, because that was probably the most important response to me. So that it allows us the opportunity to lead and participate in changing the way we work as a philanthropy, and hopefully being better able to support work out there that really is about changing conditions and policies that affect, in this case, particularly people of different races who've been really just perpetually oppressed over years in ways that are sometimes explicit and often more insidious. So I think I've gotten a lot of responses in general to say, I think the COVID response to that, my colleagues on it, it allowed us actually to have some really interesting conversations, and we ended up with the final round of funding that gave out the largest sized grants to organizations that were led by Black or Latinx leaders. But that wouldn't have happened without the conditions that were set probably by that article, by the murder, by asking everyone to pause and work at a different pace, because a moment was calling for us to actually do something radically different than what we were doing. So that was another response that actually led us to a really different, a radically different outcome that everyone was really pleased and proud and open to doing, even if there was some skepticism about how might we do that, because we don't typically fund these groups for all the reasons that we usually say. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, even though folks have been on the ground doing work for decades that really fit the bill of what we were trying to do through the fund. So, I mean, I got calls from, national colleagues and those things, but the more important responses were in the immediate that allowed these platforms that I were part of to pivot immediately, and hopefully for the longer term, which is the goal that I have.
I also, when I read the article, I thought you were sending, I thought one of the clear takeaways I had was that, there was a flurry of announcements. Every group put out a statement, presumably sincere, decrying systemic racism and so forth. But I thought you were also saying, don't stop there. Don't just put out a nice statement and feel like you've done what you need to do.
Yeah. The challenge is, or the thing I get frustrated by, and this is, my team will say, yes, and, right, these things are good, because they feel frustrating to me, because they feel like a pattern that we have in philanthropy, which is, for the next several years, we're going to try to eradicate racism. And how do you do that in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, right? So the rush to have all of these statements, that felt like more of that, right? Of like, well, we have to say something. Grand Victoria Foundation did not put out a statement, and my team would say, "What are we going to say?" And I said, "Well, we're going to try to do. Let's figure out how we're going to do it." And our statement will be embodied in our actions as much as we can do that. So yeah, it was a reaction to like all of that to say yes. And we had this problem long before, which means it'll be with us long after. And we can do things like put out statements. That is good. We could create racial justice and racial equity funds and figure out different ways to deploy and allocate funding. We could do that. And we could keep going, right? How do we actually count where these dollars go? Because we don't have really great taxonomy, like, in terms of how we track these things as a country in our sector about doing that. Can we do that better? One, right? How do we think about different ways that our processes don't create these barriers on an everyday basis in the way in which we give out funding, right? So might we give out general operating funding more because we could trust these organizations that they could fulfill their missions rather than prescribing what we think the solutions should be to people who are working in community all the time, right? How do we do things like the ICRF did, which is deploy funds more rapidly when people need them, when they can't foresee crises? Can we figure out how to do that and add that to our toolbox and do that over time? Can we figure out how to have a different kind of mix of experiences on our staff and board teams that allow us to have these different kinds of conversations that lead us to having ways that we think about doing our work or supporting other work differently? Those are all more structural changes that we can do that will add to the statement or the short-term funding, that we can continue to be on a path to more structural, more long-term, more permanent change, so that we can do things like at first reduce the disparities, but ultimately get to more policies and practices that are very intentional to say, once we reduce them, we want to get rid of them. We have to change these rules in order to do that so that we don't have to come back to that again, to alleviate the symptom and to go through that process again, right?
Well, what is your most hopeful scenario? I mean, what do you think? We've heard many people say that they think this could be a pivot point in American history. What can happen in a positive way from this moment?
I mean, a lot of positive things have happened, right? The existence of the ICRF just on its own is like super positive, and to figure out a way to continue to think about a system of philanthropy for the entire state versus kind of a more provincial approach of like, we have this group that serves as this county or these two towns or whatnot. That's a place to start to like figure out how we can get past some of those things and to really figure out how to have a different kind of distribution of philanthropy throughout the state of Illinois. I think I feel hopeful. I feel very hopeful about that. And Forefront might be, an institution that could be part of something like that because of its mission. So that's a thing that I feel hopeful about. I feel really hopeful that it is really heartening to see, like I've been part of conversations around race and equity for the past 20 years. And most of the time I'm in those discussions with other people that look like me. So a lot of the times is we're, preaching to the choir, or we just need to have a safe space where we can kind of recover and recharge from the things that we experience on a daily basis and then go back out and do the work. That's looking different. So having a conversation with someone like John Palfrey at MacArthur, right, on that panel that Forefront hosted in June, and including a lot of other different people, and particularly white people in a racial justice conversation, I'm very hopeful about that. In Chicago, we're fortunate enough to have like, it's an interesting moment where there are like 20 plus leaders of local foundations that are people of color and mostly women. I think having a different kind of mix of leadership at the chief executive level will be meaningful, and that you'll see that manifest over time in terms of the way people think about changing the structures of their organizations from the inside so that they look and feel different on the outside. I think you'll see that manifest differently, and I think it creates an opportunity to work with other colleagues differently and better. I'm very hopeful about that. So I think there are, and I'm hopeful that from the perspective of philanthropy, so much of what we had to do, we had to partner really differently. We did that really smartly. We had to let go of a lot of orthodoxies like within the sector that allowed us to get money out fast and to the right places. I'm hopeful that we can keep doing that. So a lot of things that happened in 2020 that were harder, right? You know, I'm complaining like the work was super fast and it was really hard, but it should be that way sometimes, right? And we should build more muscle so that the next time we have to do that, it's much easier. We can do it even more quickly. There won't be whining, you know, as part of it, right? But that's just the way it should be, because that's how the work happens out there for the folks who are doing the work on the ground. So we set a lot of conditions in 2020 for the work to be better and more fabulous and have different kinds of partnerships and different kinds of inclusion. And I'm hopeful that that'll lead to even more kind of provocative ways that we think about what social change looks like, what social justice looks like, what racial equity and justice looks like for whom. And that in a state like Illinois, we can have these really, really interesting conversations about what all of that looks like. In a state that I've learned over the past 3 years in particular is it is so rich with assets and talent and passion and beauty. 2020 unlocked a lot of that for us, I think. And I look forward actually to working more with people in Southern Illinois and Metro East and the Quad Cities, you know, these are places that I've visited, and I've met people who are so earnest and so visionary about what it is that they want for their homes, towns, right? And I'm excited that we can be part of that.
Well, Sharon, you're involved in some other things, and I'd like you maybe you could briefly kind of tell us about those. I mean, one is the Mikva Challenge, Illinois, the African American Legacy, and also Willie's Warriors. Tell us about those programs.
You know, those things all have something in common, just really like interesting ways to think about civic leadership and engagement. I was privileged to be the board chair for Mikva Challenge for a couple of years. I was on that board for many years. It is like young people getting civically engaged. It's everything that we saw in 2020, right? Is embodied in that organization. And so it really is a way to think about democracy more as a verb, which is really kind of the tagline. Is like, get out there, get involved, take action. And it was someone, it was founded by Abner Mikva, who you might consider to be statesman-like, you know, in terms of what your work is like. But Ab was prophetic in thinking about like what the world could be like through the eyes and actions of young people. And so that was a place that I hold very dear to my heart, and it really embodies so much of what we saw in 2020. I think for African American Legacy, that was a place where I got to do the work that I didn't really get to do at other places in philanthropy, right? Like we was a donor advised fund, so a group of us who all pull resources together in partnership with the Chicago Community Trust. And we get to fund these African-American led and focused organizations in Chicago, mostly on the south and west sides of the city, with these really like energetic, dynamic leaders that might often get overlooked, but we can help provide them with seed capital to like really think about and explore what their work could and should look like in community. So some of those things are radical ideas that have grown to be like these really great things. And then Willie's Warriors is just, it's like leadership development. So like none of these things can happen without like energized, prepared leaders. These are all women. The program is named after Reverend Willie Barrow, who was the co-founder of Operation Push, which people associate with Jesse Jackson, but she was there all the time, right? So to have kind of her legacy be manifest through the support of other women who can also like take action and do work in community for community, just all wonderful. So all of those things I probably are very personally dear to me. Is probably how I carry out my work as an individual. And I don't know, hopefully bring that to the institutions or places that I also work on professionally.
Well, finally, Sharon, how do you like to relax when you've kind of been able to break away from all of this work? This is probably a pretty good year to watch U of I basketball. Are there some ways?
'Cause they're finally good.
That's right. Are there some fun things you like to do to just sort of relax and decompress?
Yeah. No, I don't know how to do that really, right? I go for a run, every other day, which I probably do that more for my mental, like, it's more relaxing than it is for me to like, have a great bod or whatever. But I do that. I'm not awesome at it, really. I've been getting outdoors probably more over the past couple of years to do hiking and that sort of thing. When I first took the job at Grand Victoria Foundation, it was kind of hard to like transition from a founder. You asked me that earlier, and like that was actually a really hard thing because she had been there for 20 years for the entire time. So I used to collect bottles of bourbon and things like that. That's not like a hobby that should last forever, but it was a temporary moment where like I learned a lot about different different types of spirits. And that helps me have conversations in other circles. So, but I have 3 daughters. They're all adults. My youngest daughter just turned 21. And one of the things about COVID that has been really great and relaxing is getting to be able to spend like just dedicated time with them. And to watch them be people like in this world. I feel really great that I get the opportunity to do that. And I don't have to do the work in the way that parents have to now. That actually is relaxing and is very gratifying. And then the last thing is I finally have mind rest to read. And so I was gifted President Obama's recent A Promised Land, his presidential memoir, and I just started it. And it's pretty wonderful. He's a wonderful writer. In the very beginning of it talks about like his time in Illinois politics. So it's very vivid and it's really funny to kind of have him recount these things, which he's done before, but as a way of like just getting away. I know those things are real life things, but it also feels like such like such a different world. It's kind of nice to get away in his book right now and to be able to have like the headspace to do that.
Great. Well, Sharon, thank you so much for your time. It's really been delightful to talk to you. And as I said before, when we were chatting, we'd love to coax you down to Carbondale. You've been here twice before, you mentioned, and to come down and see this. I know you're familiar with this region, but to get out. I want to come to the Shawnee,
so we can go to the Shawnee National Forest. Maybe you and I could go take a walk out there.
There are plenty of hiking trails there.
Yeah. So that's a goal.
That would be fun. I would enjoy that. So Sharon, thank you so much. So stay safe and keep up the really amazing work. And again, the Institute is really grateful of the time you gave us today, but also grateful of the work that you're doing for Illinois. And we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be with you.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. A video of this interview will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Please look at that and send it to your friends. And thank you for supporting us and keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.